Hi, my name is Evan B. Howard, and today I am bringing you a lecture on modern developments in Roman Catholic monasticisms. Again, more technically, I'm presenting a review of some developments in the history of Roman Catholic religious life. But people these days don't know what religious life is, and so I'm simply using the term monasticisms to cover this ground. But I draw attention to these terms again in this lecture because it is in this modern period, particularly from the 16th to the 20th centuries, that Catholic religious life takes a distinct shift toward the active life and consequently looks less and less of what some might think the term monastic is all about. First, however, I think it might be helpful if I give you a brief review of some key, what you might call legal developments in Roman Catholic religious life prior to the 16th century, or the Reformations, as we might call them. I say legal developments because throughout the history of the Christian Church, the life and beliefs of Christians were to some degree governed by synods and councils and bishops and an ecclesiastical authority of some sort. More particularly from the Council of Chalcedon in 451 on, monastic expressions were subject to the guidance, the oversight, and the correction of the ecclesiastical authorities, the hierarchy. Now, what this means, of course, is that if I wanted to start a new monastic thing, I could not just go and start it and expect episcopal approval or support or oversight or these sorts of things. Now, I could start something, of course, but depending on what I started, my activities could be viewed as dangerous. And you know what this might mean. I say this not to disparage church hierarchy. Believe me, how we navigate our freedom and submission to the guidance of others as devout individuals and as pioneering expressions of the devout life is an important issue to think through carefully. I have seen fresh expressions squashed by overbearing leadership, and I have seen other fresh expressions implode for lack of appropriate guidance. Lord, give us wisdom. Now, back to the legal history. The point here is that the Roman Catholic Church, at key points in history, made some official decisions that shaped from then on the character of Catholic religious life. And I think it might be helpful, before I discuss a couple of the changes that took place from the 16th century on, to give you a sense of where things were at that point in time. So, here goes. Around 752, there was an attempt to enforce the Benedictine rule upon all European monasteries. Now, it had succeeded to some extent, and it did serve to bring a measure of continuity to religious life throughout much of the Catholic world. In 817, the Synod of Aachen reaffirmed this decision through imperial decree. Individual monasteries then were to govern themselves by the Benedictine rule, but were permitted to interpret this rule for their own setting through the drafting of what were called constitutions. The regulations set at this Synod of Aachen created a uniform monastic system in the West for the first time in history. In 910, in response to developments with regard to the monastery at Cluny in France, the Western Church approved the existence of what were called orders, collections of monastic houses, centrally governed through a central house and leader with its own set of constitutions for this group that governed a number of associated monasteries. That's what an order is. I think of an order generally as almost like a medieval religious franchise That might be the way you look at it. So, in 1139, moving forward, in light of the early development of these lay, semi-monastic expressions of one sort or another, some of which we liked and some of which were dangerous, the Second Lateran Council declared that, and I quote, "We decree that pernicious and detestable custom of some women..." We decree that pernicious and detestable custom of some women who, though they live neither according to the rule of Blessed Benedict, nor according to the rules of Basil and Augustine, yet wish to be commonly regarded as nuns, be abolished. Now, while this regulation may seem like a serious restriction, it actually permitted nuns, and male religious as well, to be organized around any of three religious rules: that of Benedict, that of Basil, and that of Augustine. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 re-emphasized this ruling, prohibiting the formation of any new religious orders. So if you were going to start an order, you could have constitutions as you wish, but they must be founded on either the rule of Benedict, the rule of Augustine, or the rule of Basil. Now, exceptions to this rule were made at this council, ultimately at the council in 1215, for the Carmelites and the Franciscans, who actually had their beginnings before this council, and of course, whose preaching did much to advance the cause of the official church. The second order of Franciscans, the poor clares or the women, were not permitted to maintain an active ministry in the world, though this is something they wanted, but were required to remain in their cloisters, devoting themselves to a life of prayer. Consequently, the experiments in women's active lives were conducted outside the boundaries of formal religious life. Among humiliati, the Beguines, members of the Third Order, Sisters of the Common Life, things like that. And it appears, it's not formal, but it appears that the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were established as part of the formal monastic profession around this time as well. So, by the time Luther nailed his theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg, I think it is fair to say that in spite of the progress made through the efforts of the mendicant orders like Franciscans and the Dominicans, Roman Catholic religious life, ultimately by this time, was in need of some help. Now, some help came in the form of spontaneous clergy support groups and orders of clergy who gave themselves to preaching and care. But one of these orders in particular was to become one of the greatest forces of the Catholic Church in history. And that brings us up to Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuits. The story of Ignatius is a delightful tale. Ignatius of Loyola, born in Spain around 1491, he led this wild life in his youth and enlisted in a soldier, hoping to obtain fame and fortune in the world of the soldier. However, in the middle of a battle, he received a shot in his legs, shattering his bones. His long recovery forced him, instead of being on the heat of battle, winning great glory, he found himself recuperating for long periods of time on a bed. And in the process, he ends up having a spiritual awakening, which really leads him to discover his more serious passion and desire to follow Christ and to serve Christ. And so, just as he had previously desired to be a secular hero for his own sake, he just kind of shifted his natural personality around, or we should say, the Holy Spirit shifted it. And he became a desire to be a soldier, a hero for Jesus. He journeyed to Palestine in hopes of doing great things for God, but was ultimately scolded for doing so and was forced ultimately back to Spain and to France to go to school. And he found himself as an adult studying a bunch of boys, studying Latin, and doing this for 11 years. By the end of his time, though, he had collected a few followers around his vision for a relationship with Christ. They called themselves the Company of Jesus, La Compañía de Jesús, which in Spanish is the company in a military sense of the word, a military company. But once again, his plans to travel to the Holy Land were thwarted, and so ultimately he and his companions just disposed themselves to the Pope and said, "We'll do whatever you want. Send us where you will," they proclaimed. And as a matter of fact, the Pope did just that. Unlike most religious orders, which had a single focus of activity, either starting schools or working in a hospital or saying the divine office or these sorts of things, the Society of Jesus, the Company of Jesus, also known in English as the Society of Jesus, or more simply Jesuits, they did it all. They preached the gospel. They founded schools, lots of them. They served the poor. Most of the Catholic universities today existing were founded by Jesuits. And from the very beginning, they traveled far and wide to serve. Wherever the Pope would have them go, there they went. Their principle of being papal auxiliaries was ultimately formulated in a fourth vow: poverty, chastity, obedience, and submission to the Pope. And the Jesuits were formally accepted then, with this third exception, as a religious order at the Council of Trent in 1545. Because they were a dispersed missionary society, many of the features of traditional monastic life had to be revised or even abandoned. Jesuits could not or should not be called back from their ministries to join in the communal recitation of the divine office or attend chapter meetings. The requirements associated with these were released. Often they would form individual houses within which a team of missionaries would be based. Those who were present might gather regularly for meals and prayers. The important things, daily private self-examination and regular confession and reception of the sacrament, they were expected. But this was an army at war, and because of this, adjustments were made. As one of their early leaders proclaimed, "We are not monks, the world is our house." And yet, voluntary simplicity, chastity, obedience to the general and his representatives, availability to the Pope. Is this monasticism or not? But perhaps I should say something about their manual of war, St. Ignatius of Loyola's Spiritual Exercises. This little book provided a guide for spiritual directors to attend to the nuances of believers being formed into the Christian life, and especially to those being formed into the vision and ministry of the Jesuit order. While on the one hand, the Jesuits might not seem all that spiritual, on the other, their pattern of prayerful self-examination, mutual spiritual direction, meditation on the scriptures, became ultimately one of the most pervasive forces and energies towards spiritual renewal in the Catholic Church. Indeed, the Jesuits have been at the forefront of religious renewal in interest in spirituality in the Catholic Church even today. This is a life of devoted service. The balance of rhythm, yes, shifted with the Jesuits to the side of action, and yet the place of prayer was not abandoned. The Jesuit life was not a cloistered life, but it certainly was a religious life. Oh, and by the way, as of 2010, and I expect this is still today true, the Jesuit order was the largest order in the Catholic Church. there are more Jesuits than any other form of religious life. Now I want to tell you about another modern Catholic expression, one which may not be as familiar to you: the Daughters of Charity, servants of the sick poor. So let me begin with a quote from their Rule of Life. And note, when this document uses the word they, it is describing the Daughters of Charity themselves, okay? Quote, "They should consider that although they do not belong to a religious order, that state not being compatible with the duties of their vocation, yet, as they are much more exposed to the world than nuns, their monastery, being generally no other than the abode of the sick, their cell a hired room, their chapel the parish church, their cloister the public streets or the wards of hospitals, they are obliged on this account to lead as virtuous a life as if they were professed in a religious order, to conduct themselves wherever they mingle with the world with as much recollection, purity of heart and body, detachment from creatures, and to give as much edification as nuns in the seclusion of their monasteries." Now, 2 points, end quote. 2 points you should notice right here from the start. First, this group openly states that they are not nuns. They do not belong to a religious order, and yet they have a religious rule of life, and yet they have a religious vocation, and they are officially recognized by the Catholic Church. And believe me, they certainly do look like nuns. So, what are these nuns that aren't nuns? And, you might ask, why are they important? Well, though you may not have heard of the Daughters of Charity, you may have heard of St. Vincent de Paul. I remember as a child putting donations into a bag and bringing the bag out so that the St. Vincent de Paul Society could pick up these donations and give them or sell them at a very cheap rate to the poor in Spokane, where I used to live. By the way, do they still do this? Well, St. Vincent de Paul actually wrote the Rule of Life that I just quoted to you. St. Vincent de Paul was a very devout man. Like Ignatius of Loyola, he wanted to do great things for God. He wanted to improve the state of devotion among clergy, and he wanted to improve the state of life of the needs of the poor. With regard to the latter, he helped start what are called the confraternities of charity around 1621, which people joined to volunteer to care for sick and beggars and victims of war and other people like that. The ministries of these charities grew both as volunteers as generous gifts, kind of expanded and expanded. But they needed administration. So, enter Louise de Marillac. You might not have heard of Louise de Marillac. Together, Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac became the parents, you might say, of the Daughters of Charity. Louise de Marillac began to visit the various ministries in 1629. She studied their activities, corrected abuses, and kind of revived their zeal. She provided on the ground a real vision and a compassion and care for all of these ministries and pulled them all together a bit. There were a number of younger women serving in these charities, and she actually held these girls in her heart. She had a burden for their own spiritual formation. Thus, ultimately, in 1633, they officially formed the Daughters of Charity as a special society, gaining formal approval for their life and their rule in 1645. Now, let's talk about the rule a bit. The rule begins with their descriptions of the life of poverty, Then the next chapter, chastity, and the next chapter, obedience. Not defined in the way of a formal monastic order, but as appropriate to women who work in the world in a common ministry day in and day out together. The rule describes the love which they are to express toward the sick poor and the virtues that they're to exhibit in their own life together. The rule specifies a set of common spiritual practices that each sister is obligated to maintain: self-examination, confession, regular assemblies for discussion, regular times of worship. Indeed, specifications are made for brief but sincere acts of devotion. This is really kind of interesting. Hearing the devotional book read for a quarter of an hour, kneeling in silence in the middle of a workplace, and then reciting a brief prayer in the middle of the day, setting aside brief times of meditation in the middle of a work day. I can go on and on about how the rule describes these things. What you see and read in this document is virtually a daily office designed for the workplace and wherever you might be. Vincent de Paul worked very, very hard to design a rule that would be accepted, that would permit women to lead a religious life outside the monastic enclosure. His mentor, St. Francis de Sales, had tried before him, but the women were ultimately assigned back to the cloister. Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac succeeded where Francis de Sales had failed. And in doing so, the Daughters of Charity changed the shape of monastic history. To quote Louise Sullivan in her introduction to the life and works of Louise de Marillac, quote, "The form of consecrated life begun by Vincent and Louise with the Daughters of Charity has become the norm for most religious congregations. Though cloistered orders are alive and well, most religious women today live their lives in apostolic communities." I cannot emphasize how significant this development is. I mean, when you ask anybody, most anybody, of their first impression of a nun, nuns are nurses, nuns are grammar teachers, nuns are social workers. Yes, there are a few who actually stay in cloisters and pray, but the vast majority of consecrated women today are now living lives of active service in the world, walking that tightrope of active service and yet trying to maintain a sincere and disciplined life of devotion and community. Ultimately, the Daughters of Charity became the most imitated and adapted form of religious life in its time, and today is still the model for many, many religious congregations, Catholic and Protestant alike. But I ask, is this monasticism? Well, let us go back for a moment, way back. Palladius, early in the 5th century, recounts in his history of early monasticism, known as the Lausiac history, he recounts the story of the brothers Palacius and Isaias. Palacius and Isaias' father had died, and they were to inherit their estate. And they wondered together, what kind of life shall we lead? They chose, as Palladius puts it, to, quote, take up the monastic life. But they expressed their commitment to this monastic life in different ways. One sold all his share of the estate, gave the possessions away, learned a simple trade that he could do and keep a life of prayer while he's working his trade, and gave himself to the simple life of the anchorite. Now, the other invested in a house, building a monastery, and then welcoming, and I quote, every stranger, every invalid, every old man, every poor one as well, setting up 3 or 4 tables every Saturday and Sunday. 2 different ways of expressing the monastic life. Now, as the story goes, after these 2 men died, there was this great discussion among folks about which one of them led the greatest life. And it's a really fun story. But to just summarize the end, they go to Abba Pombo, the real wise and old elder of the bunch. And Abba Pombo ultimately receives this vision from God, and he declares, "I saw them both standing in paradise in the presence of God." There you have it. Even in their own time, the Jesuits and the Daughters of Charity did not consider themselves nuns or monks. They were captive to a stereotype of monasticism that was rooted in an assumption that monks and nuns needed to be enclosed in some kind of monastic structures, spending most of their time praying in office and doing manual labor. Well, I beg to differ with this stereotype. I think that monasticisms come and must come in many shapes and sizes. Now, there are strengths and weaknesses in many of these expressions. The contemplatives can lose sight of community and care. The actives can lose sight of their relationship with God. I have seen both of these. The pendulum swings here and there, and it requires not some definitive formula of religious life that we can kind of impose on everybody, but rather a generous share of Christian wisdom in the midst of our honest and sincere and devoted experiments at living the Christian life. I hope that you are one of those who will seek this kind of wisdom in the midst of experience and experiment. And furthermore, I hope that you have a wonderful day.